Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. At this time when so many are cynically changing views and trying to make a fistfight out of politics, I found it reassuring to browse through the new exhibit on Mayor John Lindsay at the Museum of the City of New York. He was true to his beliefs, and he believed that we live in a city whose humanity, rather than its buildings, should be the legend. And so do I. I'm proud to have been a part of John Lindsay's government, and I think Dick Aurelio is too. He was the deputy mayor at the center of this city hall and my guest today. So how do you feel? What did you think?
I'm also proud to have been associated with John Lindsay, not only as his deputy mayor in his second term, but as his campaign manager.
You got him elected.
For his re-election. And a friend of his from his Washington days when he was a congressman, and I might say a trailblazing congressman.
You were worked for Jake Javits.
Yeah, I was chief of staff for Senator Javits in Washington, and that's really where I first met John Lindsay. And we used to have New York State congressional caucuses, and occasionally I would be allowed to go into them with Javits. And Lindsay was always the shining star of those meetings.
Why do you think it's taken so long for an exhibit to be mounted about the Lindsay years? And why do you think that he is not listed basically as one of the very best mayors we've ever had?
Well, after Lindsay left, he never really felt the need to promote his legacy. He was just he left it to others. He never felt that he needed to do that, and he lived a relatively quiet life after that. He went to Europe for a year. He got involved with Lincoln Center. And then of course he got very ill in his later years. But at no time was he bitter after it. He thought he had done. He had made what he wanted to do in New York, and he had created a new vision of the cities, and that was enough, for him to be satisfied.
He was very confident, wasn't he? I mean, he didn't have to keep proving himself to people the way some of our politicians do.
Absolutely, there was never any question in his mind that what he set out to do in New York was the right thing.
Yeah.
His two great passions, which emanated from his Washington days, was civil rights. His feeling that the country just couldn't exist with an isolated minority community, and he was determined to address that when he became mayor. And his other passion was that the cities which he loved New York City so much, needed to be revised and re-energized and reinvented. And those two passions led him to connect it with the Vietnam War, which he opposed so vigorously.
From very early on.
Very early on. He was really one of the early opponents of the Vietnam War, mainly not only because he thought it was a foolish war, but also because he thought it took away resources that should have been used to address the problems of the inner cities and minorities who had been disadvantaged for so many years.
Mm-hmm. He also, he has a reputation for not managing the city. And I don't think that's true at all. I think he really reorganized the city.
Yeah, right from the beginning, people don't give him credit for some of the things that endure today in terms of the reorganization of the city. He inherited a mishmash of agencies that were dysfunctional and organized them into super agencies that still exist today. things like the Environmental Commission.
He started the Environmental Protection Agency.
Right, the Hospitals Corporation.
Right, absolutely.
And several other agencies.
The Consumer Affairs.
Consumer Affairs.
The Addiction Services Agency.
Right.
OTB.
OTB, air pollution was a big priority of his.
And he put super agencies, so he had housing, HDA, was it? The Housing Development Agency, Human Resources Agency, the Health Services Agency, and under that, he built a very good, sound government.
Right, that has prevailed to this day.
And he hired very good people.
Yeah, I think one of his great legacies is the incredible talent that was attracted to him and to what he was doing, because there were people all over America and certainly in New York saw a mayor who was interested in essentially re-energizing and reinventing the city. And you remember, this came at a time when people had given the feeling that the cities were gone as really a place to live, and that the future was in the suburbs. And he was very strongly against that attitude and felt that cities needed to be revitalized, and either in urban design and all kinds of innovations, and he set out to do it.
His urban design and his planning department were exceptional, and as a matter of fact, I think the only master plan ever created in the city of New York was done in that administration.
Right.
Still the same. I mean, people don't pay attention to it, I guess, by what's happening.
It was the master plan, some of the various traffic changes that he made. The vest pocket parks, the opening the parks to people, and the banning automobiles at various times.
Before he was mayor, you couldn't walk through Central Park, I think.
Right.
And when he became mayor, it was the glory of the parks. I mean, he just had so many activities and different things and such enjoyment.
Yeah, and it wasn't without opposition. People thought, oh, we're spoiling the parks.
Cut the traffic through the park.
Too many people in the parks. And, I remember him saying, what are the parks for except for people? They're not for automobiles. And, but people would criticize him for spoiling the...
Sometimes he got carried away a little bit. I remember when he wanted to build the stables in the park, and the park people went crazy, and he couldn't understand that. But you're right, the framework was a city is a glorious place, and we're going to make it as good as possible. That means, and it carries on, that everybody should have the opportunity to lead a decent life in this city.
Right.
And therefore, more attention to the poor and neglected neighborhoods.
And people forget that when he came in, there was a general sense that the cities had had its better days, and that there was, a dramatic shift from the cities mainly because of the fear of minorities that had become, and the ghettos, and
the influx from the South and from Puerto Rico.
From Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
And the way he addressed that almost from day one was to spend endless time walking the streets of the ghettos, often without any knowledge of anybody else, and talking to people and listening to their grievances. And it was really, they say Ted Kennedy's great passion in his life was health care. The great passion in Lindsay's life was civil rights.
And he also, we'll get back to the civil rights, but he opened the city with communication. And when he ran, he established those neighborhood offices, right? Then they became the mayor's task forces. I mean, everybody in the administration was assigned a neighborhood. I had Greenwich Village, I remember.
Right.
And you'd go to the meetings of the task force, and you would be the liaison between the communities. And we had all kinds of departments or groups of people working with the communities.
Well, there was a feeling that he had a feeling that the neighborhood should control their destinies.
Right.
And he may have overreached on some of that, as some people have contended. But but his intentions were
Right.
were correct. I mean, people were alienated from their government, and they needed that sense of involvement and control. And I think the way we have it's been institutionalized through the charter revision that he
now. Yeah.
that actually started during his second term. Is I think been a very positive thing because the communities do feel like they have some involvement,
And they were smart enough also, not only with the involvement about services and what's going to be where and where you can have vendors and do all that stuff. There was another task force. I know there was a Goddard, a Davidoff operation. There was a Lou Felstein and Mudd. What was his first name? Anyway, John Mudd.
John
their
Mudd, yeah.
operation. They knew what was going on in the city.
Oh, absolutely. There was the important thing that I think we all realized was that it was to understand the flow of this complex city and the tensions and the anxieties that were going on in the neighborhoods. You had to have, in effect, an intelligence operation, and therefore these urban task forces that he set up were designed for that purpose, to go out into the communities to learn what their problems were and to report them back, so they wouldn't feel isolated, and to try to address them. And I think that was a very successful.
For people who
effort.
weren't here in the Lindsay administration, I would think that it's comparable now to the 51 city council members with their district offices. Now you've got 51. In those days, it was much less. I think it was 35, and they were more general, and I don't think they did the kind of work. They didn't have the kind of budgets. It was a whole different city council.
Right.
So it was very different in those days, and unless you were a mayor with the kind of philosophy Lindsay had, you really didn't know what was going on, I don't think. Now,
Yeah, correct.
it was the time of all these movements, civil rights movement, the peace movement, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement, the women's movement. It was a time when people were speaking back, talking up and speaking back, as they said. And so it was a very exciting time, but it was very complicated.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that period was the most convulsive of the last century.
Yeah.
For the reasons you mentioned, plus the assassinations that occurred during that period of Martin Luther King and
Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy,
Yeah.
and the drug.
The returning veterans from Vietnam also.
The Vietnam War, the protest against the Vietnam War, the sexual revolution, Woodstock, all these incredible events that would dominate most decades. And this decade, there were so many of them that it's just hard to keep track of.
It was so exciting.
It was
And
exciting.
when you think about it, the people who were active in these different movements, they were John Lindsay fans. In a way, it's the people who weren't active, who were afraid of the change, that are now credited with all the criticism of Lindsay. Is that a good generalization?
Yeah, I think there was a sense that there is a sense now that of fear of that instead of confronting it as he wanted to do and I think succeeded in many ways during that period. Today we seem to fear it. We seem to be more dominated by fearing the repercussions of doing social programs.
Right. Of reaching out.
Of reaching out.
Changing.
Yeah, I mean, this recent healthcare debate is to me a shining example of that. The debate was essentially a debate of fear on one side, that fear that it was somehow going to create a whole new mosaic out there in healthcare that was scary. I mean, you heard some of these
Right, the death panels, or whatever
death
they are.
panels and so on. It was all based on fear, and I think Lindsay would have really if he were living today, really regretted that because, you know, he was so courageous in the sense that, you know, he wanted to go out to those neighborhoods and touch those people and make them feel that they had a piece of the action.
Right. He wanted to change things, and he reached out. Sometimes, as you said, he overreached. But that's a good thing, in a way, to overreach. I mean, you want to move forward. So the school strike is always an example of the decentralization and the strike by the teachers. I mean, that wasn't really a test of local control and decentralization. It really became a test of race and perceived anti-Semitism, and it was encouraged. It was developed, right?
And I think it was encouraged largely by media pundits who were, as they always seem to be doing, looking for a theme of the times, and so they kind of structured that as the backlash, you know, the backlash of the Jews, the Jewish community, and of the white middle class, which I think was largely exaggerated.
And you pointed out, I think, in the second election, he won a high percentage of Jewish voters.
He actually won 8%. I mean, don't forget, in his first term, he had everything going for him.
He was this handsome,
his
gorgeous
first election,
person.
you know, he was the man on the horse, and there was just hope, you know, and Wagner had messed the city up so badly, and the city was in such crisis that it was but in his re-election campaign, there was all this notion that there was going to be a huge backlash among particularly the Jewish community.
And outside boroughs. Outer
boroughs.
boroughs is there.
Right. But in fact, he not only got, I think, 8% more
of the
Jewish votes, but he also carried Queens, which everybody said he would never be able to carry Queens because of a snowstorm earlier. And he carried the very neighborhoods where the snowstorm was supposed to have been the, a terrible negative.
There was a film on Channel 13 recently, and it said the different crises. It was based around the crises, the transit strike. And it occurred to me today, he had respect for the transit strike. Was basically also underlying a question of race, right? It was the Irish staying in for control, but he treated them as if they're laboring people. I mean, he wanted to negotiate, and they had a transit strike. Fine, and that wasn't a disaster. Ed Koch had a transit strike, and it went 8 days, and nobody recites that as his legacy. And more than that, when there was a transit strike with Bloomberg, he called them bums.
Right.
So you see the whole difference.
Well, and you know, the other thing that has never really been pointed out is that if you look back at the period, the polls at the time showed that 75% of New Yorkers supported Lindsay during that transit strike.
Right.
They were happy to see a mayor standing up to Quill, and so there was it became a sort of happening, and people, you know, sure, it was a it was a difficult way to begin an administration, but it did cement the idea that this was a mayor who was going to be operating a lot differently.
It's I was thinking about it because when I was in City Hall, I worked in City Hall, and I actually worked with you, and you hired me basically, and I loved working with you. It was great, and I learned a lot. But when I was in the city council. When I was in City Hall, I realized that in your government, you don't respond to what really happened. You respond to what people think happened. And that's how the press reported. And over the years, it's even been worse. So you've got these crises, right? And I don't believe they were really crises. So it's...
I agree with you. I think
on the one hand, he's attacked because he didn't negotiate with the unions, and on the other hand, he's attacked because he gave away contracts that were too generous. So where do you go?
Right.
So let's just, we're running out of time, and we have so much to talk about. So how do we relate it to today? I mean, it is exactly this. It's almost exactly the same. You mentioned the health legislation. Let's look at the immigration legislation. I mean, that would run totally against John Lindsay's soul.
Unbelievable. No question about that. That is another issue that is based on fear. We forget that we're a country of immigrants. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my immigrant parents, and what's going on with the reluctance to confront it is really sad.
The other outstanding thing in politics is the lack of courage on the part of policymakers or elected officials, and then the deviation from their principles. That's it. I don't know. Look at McCain. It's embarrassing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's embarrassing that because for a while, he was so attractive as a maverick and as someone who is, willing to confront issues, and now he's just been paralyzed by the fear that he's going to lose his job, and he's not really speaking the way he did a few years ago.
So,
that is sad. That's very sad. The one thing about that Lindsay did that even against the advice of some of us was he was determined to confront issues. He didn't care about the downside. Whenever you pointed out, there's a major downside to that, he would always say, well, I know, but we've got to confront it. He hated the notion of committees to study something. We know what's right here. We know what we have to do. Why don't we just confront it? So we're going to take some beating and some punishment for it, but, so what? That's what we're here for. And I think that that's the thing that is missing in all the reviews of his of those 8 years.
And it was in 8 years that was so filled. So out of it, you had the attention to the people of color in the neighborhoods, and also, as you said, his love for the cities and his way of organizing to make people think that cities were desirable and of great need. The moving out to the suburbs, he really articulated the urban issues of the times.
Yeah, I remember when he asked me to run his campaign for re-election. He told me that his dream was to give the city the feeling that it could renew itself, that there was this never-ending ability of a city to renew itself, and he also showed me polls, which and at that point I was in a situation where I already spent 8 or 9 years in Washington, and I thought I was going to be through with politics. But when he showed me polls that showed that the largest negative against him was that he was too good to the problems of the minorities. And I think that persuaded me more than anything else, knowing New York and how progressive and compassionate it was. The people that I knew were that I just couldn't believe that New York would penalize a mayor for that reason.
And that was after the riots in other cities.
Right.
That's what's so interesting. New York City was the only city that survived that time and that crisis.
But there was this myth, really again brought on by some of the press, that he had bought off the black community. What indeed he did was use federal grants and city grants to establish youth programs. He also developed that urban coalition, the Give a Damn campaign, to get businesses and industries in the city to create jobs for youth. And, he may have failed to reach out to the middle class during that period.
That's so ridiculous. I just can't believe that. I think some people felt neglected, but there are middle-class people who wanted the city to be invigorating and beautiful.
And one of the great things he did in his re-election campaign was he was determined to go out to those communities that were hostile. And he was willing to admit mistakes, and he was willing to tell them that, that he understood their feelings about feeling that he neglected them and showed preference to minority groups. But he also always made the point that it was in their interest.
Right. That what happens here
that minority
affects you.
groups
Right.
in the city not be isolated, that they're part of the city, and they had to be part of the city if the city was going to get revitalized and was going to be stabilized. And fortunately, there have been some relapses to that in recent years, and I hope we never forget that.
Well, I think you should write a book. I do. You're a writer. You started as a newspaper man, right?
Yeah, my whole journalist.
You're a writer. This mayor was clearly a far-reaching, thoughtful, and what the word is, I don't know, futurist. And he deserves more credit than he's gotten, and so do you. And so now that we've come to the end of the program, that's how we're going to end it. Dick Aurelio is going to write a book about those times and what's happened today. It's an interesting relationship. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for an interesting conversation.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.